So let's get started. What are we going to cover today? Well, essentially today's session is going to be split into three main segments. First of all, we're going to have a look at the 11+ exams in general. We're going to look at when they take place in the year, how they're run, what format they come in, and what the sort of key principal subject areas are that are covered throughout those exams. And within that section, we're also going to look at the difference between the two main exam boards. And then the second part of the session this evening is going to focus on what we're calling the 11+ tutor checklist. So essentially, what is it that your students need to know to feel confident when they go into those 11+ exams? What is it that you need to be teaching them as an 11+ tutor? And to do that part of the session this evening, we're going to have a look at some of the questions that can appear in the exam papers, particularly around the non-verbal reasoning and the verbal reasoning papers, because they are very different to what's normally taught on the Key Stage 2 curriculum. And to finish that sort of part of the session this evening, we're going to just have a quick look at how to structure an 11+ tutoring session, some ideas, and it'd be really good to have some other people's feedback at that point in time through the chat if you've got some ideas or any questions around structuring 11+ tutoring sessions. And then to close our session this evening, we're going to have a look at some of the wraparound bits of 11+ tutoring, some of the other things that tutors can offer to support students who are going through that 11+ tutoring journey. And we will finish with a quick look at some of our recommended resources that can support tutors. And as Matt said, that information will also be sent to you on the feedback form after the session. I hope that's all okay. If so, we will get started. First question, really, to get started this evening, it'd be really nice to know how many people here already tutor for the 11+. So if you do already tutor for the 11+, send a heart. Well, perfect. Everyone knows how to use the emojis. So lots of hearts, lots of no's, and some people just starting. Oh, that's a lovely mix. There's quite a lot of people here that are already tutoring for the 11+. So that is fantastic. It'd be really nice if you wouldn't mind adding in any of your thoughts or your comments into the comment box as we go along. That's all right, Charlotte, don't worry. Yeah, to add in your comments as we go along so that we can get your opinion and your feedback as well. So please feel free to use the chat, basically. Okay, so our first part of today's session is what is the 11+ and how do the 11+ exams work? Well, essentially, the 11+ is an entrance exam. It's a selective exam that is used by grammar schools and independent schools across the country. I think it's important at this point to highlight the difference between a grammar school and an independent school because they are different. Grammar schools are essentially state schools. Anybody is open to apply for a place in a grammar school. Independent schools are private schools, and some of them work closely with private primary schools, prep schools, and others don't. But there is a difference between those two types of schools, and the way in which they run their 11+ exams, their entry exams, can change, can be different. So it's important to know that there is that difference there. Also, when we talk about the 11+ exam, we're not talking about just one test. We're talking about a range of different exam papers that can be set by different exam boards that can test different subject areas at different times in the year, and that can range from school to school. So the 11+ is complicated for that reason. It's very different for each area, for each school. And so one of the most important things to remember when you're first starting out working with a new student who's preparing for their 11+ exams is to know exactly which school or which schools they're applying to, because then you can tailor your tutoring to meet those schools' requirements. And that is a really important point that we'll come back to a number of times throughout the session today. So when is the 11+ exam taken? Well, it's an entry exam for entry into year 7, for entry into secondary school. And it's taken when children are in year 6. So for grammar schools, the entry papers are normally sat at the beginning of year 6. But again, that can change slightly. And for independent schools, they are generally sat a little bit later, so around the December, January time of year 6. But again, that can change. It is different from school to school. So again, really coming back to that really clear point, make sure you know which schools your students are applying to so that you can have the specific information for each school. At the bottom of this slide, there's a small image of a resource that we have, which is a key dates timeline. I think that Beth is going to share that with us in the chat, so you can access that resource, and it goes through the key sort of deadlines and the key dates that you need to be aware of when you're tutoring students for the 11+. So it is quite a handy resource to have. In terms of which format do the exams take, well, once again, it changes from school to school. Generally speaking, for grammar schools, the format of the exams will depend on the exam board that the grammar school has chosen to use. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the different exam boards in a few minutes, but that will essentially determine the format. The 11+ exam papers can either be written exam papers, so long answered questions, or they can be multiple choice papers, or they can come as computer-based papers that are done online. Independent schools, again, they are slightly different, so they can choose to follow the format of an exam board. They can use a paper that's been set by an exam board, or they can have their own bespoke papers that are written for them by another organisation, or they can create their own in-house papers. And the information as to how the independent school is going to set its papers, whether it's going to use an exam board paper, whether it's going to write its own papers, that information is normally shared by the school on their website as part of their admission criteria. So you can get that information before you start working with a student. Again, coming back to that really crucial point of knowing where they're applying to, so you can tailor appropriately. Okay, are there any questions at this point before we move on, Beth, that we need to look at in the chat, or are we fine?
No, we've not had any questions come through, just some confusing school names in Charlotte's area. Independent schools using grammar in their school name, which definitely confuses things.
It definitely does. Yes, it's already a confusing subject area. Okay, great. So if there's no questions, we'll move on. So generally speaking, which subject areas are we looking at for the 11+? Well, we're looking at English, maths, verbal reasoning, and non-verbal reasoning. But not every school will test every subject area. So you may have one grammar school that decides to set papers in English and verbal reasoning, and then you can have another grammar school that chooses to set papers in maths, non-verbal reasoning, and reasoning. And then you can have another that chooses to set papers for all 4 subject areas. So it is confusing. Not every school will test every subject area, and it's important to know so that you prepare your student appropriately. Because of course, if they don't need to focus on non-verbal reasoning, there's no point looking at that in your tutoring sessions. Okay, so we mentioned, yes, creative writing, Liz. Sorry, I've just seen that's come up in the chat. Absolutely. I sort of was covering that as part of English, but absolutely, that's another area. So the exam boards, as we spoke about, there are 2 key exam boards that set papers for the 11+, and these are the GL and the CEM. Both of them can create papers that test on all of the subject areas. And there are differences between the 2 exam boards and the way in which they set their papers. And those differences really focus on the format of the papers, the type of questioning that they used, and also the time allowance that they give for students to respond to the questions on their exam papers. So those are kind of like the highlighted key areas of difference between the 2 exam boards. But what I would say at this point is that there are differences, a lot of differences between the 2 exam boards, more than we can probably cover here. And so a little, after a couple of slides, I will show you where we can find information, a bit more information around the difference between those 2 exam boards on our website, just to give a greater detail, really. But as an overview for now, key differences would be that the CEM tends to group its English and verbal reasoning skills together into one paper, and then maths and non-verbal reasoning into another, whereas the GL tends to create papers, separate papers for each of the different subject areas. And another thing to really remember at this point is that the CEM has announced earlier this year that it is going to be moving to more of a computer-based format. And so that will have changes for next year, potentially, and for this year also. There may be some schools that prefer to use a computer-based format. There'll be others that don't. And so there may be a switch in which exam board different people choose to go with. Both exam boards can produce standard formats and multiple choice format questions. And then in terms of the time allowances for the papers, historically with the GL papers, students are given a time limit for the completion of the whole paper. So most 11+ papers are about 45 minutes in length, When the student is given their paper, they are able to manage their time for the completion of their paper as much as they want to, really. They've got that 45 minutes. They manage their time for the completion of the paper. But with CEM, historically, there's been a time limit per exam paper section. And that time limit has generally somewhere between 6 and 12 minutes. And once that time is finished, they need to move on to the next section of the paper. What we haven't gone into here, but which is something that is important, is that there are something also called consortiums, where different grammar schools can come together and they can decide to create a consortium, and they will set a particular type of paper, or they will choose to just set one particular paper, and all of the schools within that consortium will look at the results that the student has got on those papers when they're making their admission decisions. And again, in a moment, I'll show you where you can find some more information around consortiums. I've also noticed that there are some questions coming up around some of the papers that are used by the independent schools. And again, as I said, there are differences with the independent schools and the way in which they set their papers. So it's not as straightforward as if you go with a school that's using a GL paper, they're definitely going to use it in this format. If you're going to apply to a school that is using a CEM paper, it's definitely going to be in this format. There are complexities around the way in which the exam boards work, and that's why it's important to look at a little more detail for each particular school that your child is applying to. But I'll show you in a second where you can find some more information on the site about those differences and about consortiums. Okay, are there any key questions at this point?
Yes, sorry, we do just have a couple. Let me find them again. Sorry, trying to scroll back. So Claire's said that the schools she's tutoring for use the ISEB. So is that more similar to GL or CEM?
So the ISEB is often used again by the independent schools, and it is generally speaking a computer-based paper style. So in which case it's more likely, I guess, to be more like the CEM. But it's difficult to say because there are lots of differences between each of the different papers and the way in which they're set. So if you are working with a school that is using the ISEB, it's really useful to look at other things that they've released and that the school have used previously to get a sense of the type of questions they're going to be posing.
Perfect. And then Natalie has asked as well, for GL, is it 45 minutes per paper?
Yes, generally speaking.
Perfect. They're all of our questions for now.
Great, thank you.
Oh, sorry, we've just got one more come as well, saying that the ISEB was multiple choice for maths. Do you know if it is still multiple choice, still in this format?
As far as I know, yes. I haven't recently looked. I haven't looked in the last few days to see if there's been any changes. Of course, the formats and the exam boards can change all of the time, but I know that multiple choice is generally is preferred anyway at the moment. So I would be surprised if it's changed.
Perfect. Okay. If anybody else has any experiences or anything to share with that as well, feel free to share your own experiences into the chat, because as Sam said, it can differ in different areas, in different schools. So share your own experiences. I'm sure everyone's got lots of different experience with the exams.
Yeah, absolutely. And because every school has got that flexibility really to decide which subject areas they're going to place the emphasis on, we're just giving sort of general kind of timescales around how long the papers are and how the exam boards work, but it is very specific to each individual school, which makes it difficult to manage, of course, as a tutor, especially at the beginning. Okay, let's have a look. So in summary, for this part of our session today, as a tutor, it's really important to know which grammar schools or independent schools your tutee is applying for. I think that point has been raised really there, that everything is so specific school to school. It's also obviously important to know when the school is going to be holding their exam. So what's the deadline that you're working to, that your students are working to, because that does change as well from school to school. Which exam board the school is going to be using for their papers, and if you're looking at an independent school, are they using their own papers? Are they using bespoke papers? You need to know that information before you start working with a tutee. And again, is the school going to be testing all of the key subject areas for the 11+, or just a subset? And are they going to be putting an emphasis on one particular area or another? And that information you can generally get when you look at the grammar schools or the independent schools websites, when you look at past papers, and you can look at their emphasis really in that way. So there's some really key things to remember when you're getting started with a new student. Okay, so I did mention that I'd just show you briefly where you can find some of the greater detail around the exam boards and the idea of consortiums and some of those more complicated areas of the exam paper setting on our website. So hopefully you can see the screen. It's quite small on my slide, but I hope you can see it easily enough. If you have a Twinkl account and you have your career set to tutor, when you log into Twinkl, you will see a scroll bar at the top of your screen that's similar to the one here, and at the very end of it, or somewhere along that top scroll bar, there should be a box that says tutor, and I've put a big red arrow to it on my screen. If you click on that box, that will take you straight through to our landing page, and as you scroll down to the bottom of our landing page, you will find a section called useful links for tutors, and within this section there's an area for tutor blogs. Again, my second big red arrow is pointing to that, and within our tutor blogs we've got loads of really useful information that you can access for anything to do with tutoring, but also around 11+ and around some of those key differences and the details on a school by school sort of exam board basis. If you don't have your career type set to tutor, it really doesn't matter. You can still find our landing page nice and easily. You just go to the search bar at the top of the page. Mine currently says on this image 11+ maths mystery. But if you type into there tutor or tutoring, you'll come through to our landing page and you can find the section easily. And I think Beth may have just shared the landing page link as well in the chat. So hopefully you've got instant access to that too. Right. Okay, so if everyone's all right at this point in time, we'll move on to the second part of today's session, which is all about ultimately what do students need to know as part of their 11+ exams? What are you tutoring them? What are you teaching them? And to start this section, I thought we'd have a look at some sort of typical non-verbal reasoning and then verbal reasoning questions that you'd find in the 11+. So we test your knowledge and have a look at a couple of sample questions and see if you're able to answer them or what you think the answer might be. This is a good opportunity to use the chat box. Apologies in advance, Beth, because it's probably going to be loads of answers, but it'd be really nice if you could, if you would like to participate. That'd be lovely. So we've got a question here, which appears frequently on the non-verbal reasoning exam papers, and that is, which of these 5 figures listed below is the odd one out? So spend a few minutes having a look. It's not that easy the first time you see it, and we'll have a look at what people think. Okay, so there's lots of answers coming in. Some slightly different answers. Seems to be a general consensus on the E, I think. Seems to be the more popular choice. Yes, lots of people have got confidence now that it is E, having looked at it for a few minutes. And you're absolutely right. So it is indeed E. And there are things that, of course, can lead you to make you think that it might be D or a C. But ultimately, the answer is E. And yeah, that's exactly right, Michelle. So the answer to that is, the reason for that ultimately is that in E, the black circle is touching the large rectangle, and in all of the others it isn't. And the smaller shape for the other options is touching the larger rectangle, and in this instance, in E, it's not. So that's why the answer is E. So well done, everybody, you got that right, and thank you for participating, everybody. It's very kind. Okay, let's have a look at the E, just to confirm. Okay, let's have a look at the next question. So which of the 5 options given below is the reflection of the figure that appears in the large rectangle above? Which one is the reflection? Shannon's quick off the mark there. So we've got some people choosing C, some people choosing D. The answer is actually D. The reason for that is that we're taking the reflection along this line. And so if you were to put the mirror there, the mirror image would be D. If you look at the black dots, the black box, sorry, that helps you, sort of a guide as we flip it over. Not easy though. The non-verbal reasoning, I think, is so tricky. Okay, for me, this is the most complicated question. So if we have a look at this question, we've got a sequence of images at the top. And then we're trying to find the image that sort of completes that sequence. And we've got 5 options at the bottom. So which of those images do you think completes that section, that series? This one is tricky. You might need a few minutes to look at it. I had to take a few minutes previously.
A question like this at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, Sam, is pretty tough.
It is, but everybody's getting it right. It is indeed A. Well done, everybody. I found that one very difficult, but maybe I need to work a little bit on my non-verbal reasoning. So A, absolutely. The triangle, I think, helps because we can see the way in which it moves up and down, and the fact that it's changing from orange to white is very helpful. And then we've got the circle on the left-hand side that moves up and down. So fantastic. Well done, everybody. I'll end the quizzing there for a second. In terms of non-verbal reasoning, obviously that's just a sort of a couple of questions that might come up, a couple of question types. There are other areas to look at. Nets and cubes come up a lot, and also 3D shapes and nets are not just cubes, but other shapes as well. Symmetry that we've just seen within that little quiz, but also rotation, how shapes rotate and which one is the next in the series of a set of rotations. Odd one out, we've just had a quick look at a particular type of question that goes with odd one out, but almost in the same vein, we've got similar figures. Yes, grids as well. Thank you, Sylvia. That's absolutely right. Grids. There's lots and lots of different types. This is really just a flavour of them. Complete the series again that we've just looked at. So difficult logical questions that don't involve words ultimately are your non-verbal reasoning questions. There's a little image at the bottom of this slide which points to a resource that we have on site, which is a non-verbal reasoning information sheet. I think is handy because it goes through the different types of non-verbal reasoning questions. It provides a definition of what that question is looking for and an example question, and then gives some hints and tips as to how to best approach those question types. So we'll share that resource with you as well. And as a tutor, obviously you're there to support your students in their preparation for this type of question. So ways to support students really for non-verbal reasoning would be definitely exposure to lots of different question types, so they feel comfortable with all of these different question types. Teaching them ways to look for patterns, working through a process of elimination. Also, if they can't see a pattern straight away, giving them the confidence to be able to work through a process of elimination is also really helpful so that they can come to the answer that way. And I would say that this applies to all of the different parts of the 11+ exam, but time management skills, they are something that are important for tutors to work on with students, particularly when it comes to 11+ exams, because they're very pressurized. They can feel like a very pressurized exam, and these students are very young. So the more that you can support them in the management of their time so they can respond to these questions in a more easier manner, then the better, really. Okay, so just going to have a very quick look at a couple of verbal reasoning questions. There's only 2 verbal reasoning questions, so don't worry. In this verbal reasoning question, you've got 2 pairs of words. So we've got branch and stem and follow and hunt. And then we've got 5 possible words underneath. And you need to choose one of those 5 possible words that means the same as the 2 pairs above. So if anyone's brave enough to give it a go. Yeah, well done, everybody. Lots of stalks coming through. Absolutely. So stalk means the same as branch and stem, and it can also mean the same as follow and hunt. And then we've got a second example, ultimately, of that question type. So then we've got bird and fowl, bend and dodge, and we need to find a word that goes along with that. And lots of people have already found that word. So duck. Yeah, absolutely. I like the little emoji sign there, Georgina, of a duck. So yeah, that's absolutely it, duck. Well done. So that would be one type of verbal reasoning question. I prefer that type of question personally. And here's a second type. So in this sentence below, you need to find the 4-letter word that is hidden between 2 words. So the 2 words are next to each other within the sentence. there is a 4-letter word hidden between those words. This can be tricky. Yeah, it can be tricky for me, but lots of people are replying already. So maybe not that tricky. So the word is sand. And that's because you take the S from the end of hats and the and from and together it creates sand. So again, that would be another question type that would appear on the verbal reason, or could appear on the verbal reasoning paper. So verbal reasoning, there are lots and lots of different areas of verbal reasoning. There's over 20 different areas of verbal reasoning that can be tested as part of the 11 plus paper. I haven't got the space almost to list them all here, but here's just a small flavour. We've got alphabet codes and letter connections. They are very popular on the verbal reasoning papers. And that's basically where you've got one set of letters and a second set of letters, and you need to find the relationship between those letters. And then again, that principle works for number codes. So you may have a set of numbers and then a set of corresponding letters, and you need to find their relationship. Insert a letter or missing letters are where you may have a word or 2 words and you have a letter that's missing that you need to then add in to complete those words or that word that's given. Find the hidden word we just had a look at when we were looking at sand, that sort of question type. Letters for numbers is always interesting. There is sometimes a little bit of maths within verbal reasoning, insofar as you can have numbers that are represented as letters, and then students need to complete some sort of a mathematical operation to resolve that question. And then there are vocabulary-based questions within verbal reasoning, where you may be given a list of words and students need to find the 2 words that don't fit that list, or the words that have got opposite meanings or similar meanings. So vocabulary is a crucial part of verbal reasoning too. So as a tutor, you're looking to support your student, of course, with these types of questions. How can you do that? Well, expanding their vocabulary is really important, especially with those vocabulary-based questions when you're looking for particularly looking at lists of words and you're trying to find one that doesn't quite fit. It's never going to be obviously not fitting. So understanding vocabulary in that way is really useful. Knowing how to use alphabet lines and number lines to find the relationship between one number or a letter or 2 letters. Ultimately, that is really important because the alphabet code questions and the number code questions require a child to use an alphabet line or a number line to be able to find that relationship. So they need to be confident with that. There are some maths skills, as we said, required for verbal reasoning, so it's important not to forget that. And again, coming back to that time management technique, how to answer those questions in a stressful, pressurized environment is really important for any exam preparation, but I always think particularly for the 11 plus. So we're going to have a quick look at English and maths in a minute, but before we do, we'll just check that there's no questions, Beth, in the chat before I move on.
We do, yeah. We've got one question from Rebecca about the find the hidden word questions, saying that with my very literal brain, they often aren't next to each other and they're on different lines. Is this something that's likely to happen in the test? So like the example just was there where the words were across 2 lines, is it likely that that might happen in the test too?
It can do. It could do. It depends how long the sentence is, how long the line is, and where the word is hidden. So I think it's about looking at the relationship between the end and beginning of words, regardless of where they may be sitting along the page. Yeah, it is tricky. It's all tricky. Okay. So before we're going to have a quick look at maths and English. There are no questions on maths and English here, you'll be pleased to know. I didn't think I'd test your knowledge of 11 plus maths and English, because I think even for me that's quite different. That would be quite harsh, I think, at this time of the evening. So I thought I'd just go straight into what's normally covered within these papers. So for maths, well, maths is maths. Ultimately, you're looking at maths up to the end of year 6. And that is important to remember because, of course, students are taking these papers at the beginning of year 6. So there is an expectation that they know the curriculum really up to the end of year 6. So there will be some knowledge gaps that you'll be needing to fill as a tutor. And also, it always says up to the end of year 6, but generally speaking, the 11 plus does test students' knowledge a little bit beyond. So you are needing to go a little bit into year 7. You need to, for some questions, some skills, the exam papers do go a little bit beyond what's required for Key Stage 2. Again, with maths, you're already looking at those 4 principal mathematical operations, so multiplying, division, etc. But doing that with big numbers, large quantities. Same with decimals, fractions and percentages, really being sure of how to use those, going to additional place values, being able to convert between them, being able to multiply them. There can be algebra on the 11+ maths papers. The papers can also test measurements, distance, time, and they can use charts to do that. They can use tables to do that, and worded maths problems as well. And that's the same for statistics, ratio and proportion. There are worded maths problems, generally speaking, and they are normally multiple steps. So again, complex maths for the end of Key Stage 2. For English, again, it can be difficult. It's pushing you to the end of Key Stage 2 and a little bit beyond. I think, as we mentioned right at the very beginning, some schools do set a creative writing paper, not all of them, but some do. And the creative writing paper doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a fictional piece that needs to be written. It may be that your student needs to write a piece of persuasive writing, a piece of non-fiction writing. So it's looking at creative writing really in its entirety, not just fictional writing. So those skills need to be practiced. Reading comprehension, of course, makes up a big part of English, all English exams, but particularly with the 11+. So again, with reading comprehension, you're looking at making sure that students can form important opinions that are maybe more detailed or complex than they will have been doing it previously in Key Stage 2, that they can compare texts, that they can analyse language in a detailed way, that they can summarise, that they can précis. Really understanding text in a detailed way. And there is often also an English language paper that can be looking at SPAG, so spelling, punctuation and grammar. It can be looking at testing that really with a bog standard question that asks you to identify some errors that are within those questions, or it can look at using a piece of text and asking them to find errors within that text piece. So in those instances, enhanced vocabulary is really important for writing, for reading, and for spelling, punctuation and grammar and English language. Knowing the definitions of different words, because they can be tested within the papers, either on the reading comprehension or on more of an English language paper. Knowing synonyms, knowing opposite words, really understanding English in a strong way. And I think, as someone's just said in the comments, there is so much for children to learn for English and to know and to remember. So it's a big area for 11+ tutoring, for the student and for the tutor, I would say. Before we move into the next section, just check if there's any questions.
Sorry, I tried to unmute, but just put a lot of spaces in the chat boxes. So no questions have come through this time. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I'm aware that the time is moving on, so I'll try and speed through this bit a little bit faster. But I wanted to just give an overview of structuring an 11+ session, because I think if you haven't tutored for the 11+ before, it can be useful. But I do know that there are quite a lot of people that do already tutor for the 11+ on the session today with us today. So it'd be really helpful if we had other people giving their ideas and their comments in the chat box, and then we can have a quick look at the end of this slide at what people have suggested as well. So this is just some ideas to get started with. Ultimately, structuring 11+ session is going to depend on the age of each student. Some students will start preparing for their 11+ exams when they're in year 3, others in year 4, year 5. So it's going to really depend on where the child is in terms of their age and in terms of their previous exposure to tutoring. So I do think it's important to remember that when you're looking at structuring any sort of tutoring session. I would also say that when you're tutoring a child for an exam, such as the 11+, you need to have an understanding as to where they are in terms of their knowledge and skills for the exam they're taking. So an initial or a baseline assessment at the beginning of some tutoring sessions is obviously important to establish that baseline really. And then I would suggest some form of a warm-up activity with your student or your students to engage them, to make sure that they're ready to participate fully in the tutoring session. Something that can be fun or engaging would be something like a vocabulary game, a quiz, something like we've just done, some challenge cards, a beat the clock
activity I always think is a good one. Add a bit of competition, either with a clock or within a group session. So it just is a nice way to start a session, I think. And then I would be looking at 1 or 2 focused activities that are based on the subject area that you're planning to study in the session. Again, this can vary depending on the number of students that you've got in the session to start with, and also maybe on their age. But I would recommend 30 to 40 minutes for this kind of focused activity work, and really focusing on either 1 or 2 activities. And I've just given a couple of examples there for focused activity work. That could be a creative writing exercise, for example. It could be looking at a reading comprehension, potentially looking at the ways in which to answer multiple choice questions. You may have a PowerPoint to look at on a particular type of maths, or some of the logical skills that are needed for the verbal and non-verbal reasoning. So something that focuses your students' attention for the majority of the session on 1 or 2 focused activities. And then to close a tutoring session, I always like to summarise personally. I'm sure other tutors do the same, to make sure that what you were hoping the child has come away with in terms of knowledge, they have actually come away with that knowledge, that there's not any sort of confusion or any gaps in what you've been trying to teach them during that time, and you can address them if there are. And again, finishing with something that's interactive, that's engaging. So again, going back to some of those ideas that we've used for the warm-up activities to close the session. So those would be my sort of suggestions for structuring an 11+ session, but I'm hopeful that we might have some other ideas or some comments in the comment box that might add to that, if there is anything, Beth.
Sorry, I was just reading through. So Claire's just asked, for tutors that are offering all these aspects, do tutors offer all the aspects of the 11+, or do you choose to focus on just one area, or maybe maths and non-verbal reasoning? I suppose that might depend on what the schools in your area are covering, but if anyone has any specific areas that they focus on, please share them in the chat as well, just to help Claire out with that.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. And I can see there are some people replying to that question, so that's really helpful. Great. Okay, well, we will move on to the next slide. So the last section really of today's session is looking at other avenues of 11+ tutoring that tutors can explore, that you might want to consider looking at. We've already spoken a little bit about the importance of time management and supporting students in their ability to manage their time when they're completing their exam papers. And that might be an area that you want to explore additionally or in more depth. So you could potentially run some mock 11+ sessions to help with that exam preparation, or signpost parents to other organisations or other tutors that you might work with who do that. I think there's another possible avenue in terms of exam stress, anxiety management, child wellbeing. That is something that tutors can explore, working in partnership with parents and guardians and the child. That may be interesting for tutors to look at. We know of more and more tutors now who are running parent or guardian information sessions, providing information and support ideas for parents or guardians so they can support their children at home in their preparation for the 11+ session. I think that's a really nice idea. So that might be something that you may consider expanding into. And then I always think there's always wraparound kind of bits of tutoring that we can easily forget, but that you do need to maybe think about, and that would be around assessment marking, the setting of homework, the marking of homework. Consider how you're going to approach those things, how you're going to charge for those things. Is that something that you're going to do additionally or within your 11+ tutoring sessions? And then sort of, I guess, running off of that, you may also want to consider running some intensive 11+ revision sessions or some group sessions, particularly over the summer period, as the 11+ exams are at the beginning of year 6. So that can be a nice avenue to explore as you become more confident and established as an 11+ tutor. So just some additional ideas. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our session today. I just wanted really to close by sharing some of our most popular 11+ resources that we have on site. And I know that we're going to share those as part of our feedback form as well, so you can access them directly, I think, hopefully through the feedback form that Matt's going to send on after this session. But we do have a lot of information on site, lots of different resources. We have baseline assessments and progress assessments for all of the different elements of 11+ tutoring you can access. We have lots of starter packs, So summer starter packs, 11 plus tutoring starter packs that are handy because they've got all of the information or all of the key resources that you need within one download. We've got a number of different mysteries and engaging games, interactive and paper-based, that you can also use. And we do have some much more detailed guides for tutors and for parents and carers to use in terms of introductions to the 11 plus. You can access all of those resources from our landing page. If you just scroll down the landing page, you'll find a section that's called 11 plus tutoring. And when you click through to that, you'll find all of our resources there.